All right, we're here. Twitch.tv/110sports, 110sportsmedia.com/live. Thank you so much for joining us on a Friday. Josh Doring, Chris Brown, they are here with me in their correct boxes on the overlay. So that really is Josh, and that really is Chris. Thank you so much for joining us on a Friday. Gentlemen, how you doing?
Doing pretty good. You know, this is the first week we don't have like NFL stuff to preview for the weekend in like 3 or 4 weeks now. So it's a little bit strange, but we got stuff to talk about. So I'm feeling pretty good.
I'm ready to go and talk about something other than football here.
Well, we actually had to use our brains when it came to, we actually had to have a conversation this week about what we were going to talk about today, because the last 3 weeks it's been, it's football. And then we'll throw something in at the end if we have time to throw something in at the end. But it gives us a chance to switch sports. We're not going to talk about football at all today. Well, except for our extensive 1 hour long preview and coverage of the Pro Bowl that isn't actually going to happen, of course. But apart
you guys
from
are
that,
cool if I like duck out for that part, right?
I
you guys are gonna carry that, right?
I suppose. I mean, I have the 10 players I think were snubbed. I've ranked every Pro Bowler in order from 1 to. That's where my knowledge stops. I don't know how many Pro Bowlers there are every year. So we're not going to talk about the Pro Bowl. We are going to talk Big 12 SEC Challenge in the second part of the show. But we're going to start in the baseball world. And, of course, Chris over there fist pumping because we're going to finally talk about some baseball. But I think the person that's most excited to talk about baseball here might be Josh, because, we were just laying our final groundwork prior to the show starting 5 minutes ago. And we know now how excited Josh is about talking about the Baseball Hall of Fame. That's the biggest news of the week around that league is the Hall of Fame the 2021 Hall of Fame class is just, it's really small, guys. It's painfully small. It's almost non-existent. And you can't even see it, which is fine because there's nobody there for you to see. Nobody surpassing the threshold to become part of the Baseball Hall of Fame. And so here we are again. I want to start with a question here because I think this is an interesting one to pose. There's part of me, so you need 75% of the votes to, this ESPN article says, needed for enshrinement into Cooperstown. I love that. Couldn't have been worded better. But nobody, the leading vote getter was pitcher Curt Schilling, him and the blood on his sock. 71% of the ballots, only 16 votes shy of the minimum. Barry Bonds was next at 61.8. So Schilling wasn't really all that close. Not really. And Barry Bonds was 10 percentage points behind him. So nobody particularly close. And my question to you all is it bad for baseball that nobody was inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame? To a certain extent, I'm like, does it really matter? But the other part of me is, does it hurt? Is it just better for the Hall of Fame, better for baseball to be able to have at least something to center around, especially in the middle, late January when very little else is going on? Is it bad for baseball to be the story, for that to be the story this week, instead of a Hall of Famer that is controversial, whether it's Bonds or Schilling or one of these, slightly controversial baseball players?
My answer would be that, right, in an ideal world, yes, there should be. It's supposed to be entertaining, right? This is supposed to be fun for the fans and entertaining and make baseball fun. So it's not as fun when nobody's in. But I don't think, this is only the second time this century that nobody has gotten in. It happens occasionally, but it's not a common occurrence, at least not yet. There's some question of whether that might be a thing that there's nobody in the next couple of years as well. That could be a possibility, and of course, a valid discussion if that's the case. But this has happened just 2 times in the last 20, 21 years, and I'm okay with it personally. Like you said, Josh, Curt Schilling fell below the 75% threshold. He was in the low 70s. He was 16 votes short, which sounds pretty small, but it's a pretty decent chunk of votes. So he wasn't, I mean, he was close. He was the closest of anybody, but he wasn't as if he was just like, 74%. He was really all that close. Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens were near 60%. In some sense, right, there was nobody joining the ballot this year that was an obvious slam dunk. And I think, right, who joins the ballot in a given year, that's not like some committee sitting there saying, well, let's put this person on the ballot this year. That's like a formula as far as you have to have played so many years. You have to be 5 years past you're retired. So some years there's just the class that becomes eligible just isn't really all that exciting. And that was the case this year. Right. And then you combine that with the group that was the closest from previous years that were still eligible. You had Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens, who have hovered around 60% now for a couple years. And they're going to be in year 10 next year. I can pretty confidently say they're not going to get in unless something crazy happens. And that was pretty, I guess, obvious coming into this year. You had Kurt Schilling, and that's the real, everybody, that's given his nature personally and the noise that he makes and getting himself in the story consistently and the controversy surrounding him. That was sort of the real question mark. Is he going to get? He was the closest. I personally think that's an interesting. That's not interesting. That's a interesting discussion. When it comes to him, it's a very heated discussion, a polarizing discussion. But I guess I'll save my thoughts on that. If we want to get into that later, I'll let Josh and you guys jump in here. But just to your basic question, though, I don't think it's a huge problem that nobody got in. I don't think there was anybody here who was in the mix this year who was horribly wronged by not being in the Hall of Fame.
Sure.
I think if it becomes a bigger trend, I'll be more concerned.
I'm right there with you, Chris. The issue is not that nobody got in. The reason for the bad publicity is the people who were the top vote getters and the controversial nature of their status and their arguments for getting into the Hall of Fame, or more specifically, the arguments for keeping them out. Right. This is not is Barry Bonds a Hall of Famer discussion. This is does Barry Bonds deserve to be in the Hall of Fame discussion. I found it interesting that I went and actually looked up the criteria, if you will, for getting in. And you're supposed to vote, quote, based on the player's record, playing ability, integrity, sportsmanship, character, and contributions to the teams on which the player played. We talk about this all the time as if it's, okay, so the Hall of Fame is history. It's about numbers. Is the person a Hall of Famer based on their achievements on the field? There's a very real argument that all of these guys, for a variety of reasons, did not meet that criteria. If you put emphasis on things like integrity, sportsmanship, character, and contributions to the teams, and
Kurt Schilling won a World Series, but whatever.
Yes, Kurt Schilling won a World Series, but there's also part of it that I looked at and go, Kurt Schilling was not popular at all with his teammates. You could argue that his behavior was a detriment to his team. Now, do his contributions on the field outweigh that? Yes. But my larger point is just you can point to things in this description and build an argument why these guys don't deserve to get in. But the trouble you now run into, which is why I find this sort of tipping point in the Baseball Hall of Fame discussion so interesting, is if you're going to sit here and say Barry Bonds doesn't deserve to get in because he didn't demonstrate integrity and sportsmanship, and Kurt Schilling didn't demonstrate character and XYZ, keep all these guys out. Who in the world is getting in soon? Because the next people up are Alex Rodriguez and David Ortiz. How can you say Alex Rodriguez deserves to be in, but Barry Bonds doesn't?
I mean, David Ortiz. I mean, and you're talking to a Red Sox fan here, and I will acknowledge that first and foremost. But I mean, I guess the only thing that you can say about David Ortiz is that, right, is his performance enhancing drugs history. Everything, I mean, literally everything else you can talk about it puts a check in the column as to why
Right.
David Ortiz should be in the Hall of Fame. But
Absolutely.
right, but he will be the ultimate test, I think, of how much do Hall of Fame voters really put on. How much weight does any sort of history with performance enhancing drugs put on? Because right, David Ortiz, from pretty much all accounts, his time on the Red Sox was nothing but good. From delivering World Series to being a beloved Red Sox, right? From at least for the overwhelming majority, being somebody who people just liked around the Red Sox organization too. But he was also a guy who said that who once upon a time said that anybody who uses performance enhancing drugs should be banned from the game, and then subsequently used performance enhancing drugs. So how does that actually, what's the weight there? Which I think can be the problem, which is also part of the problem for the next several years.
Exactly.
And all of those guys who were a part of that era of the game where you almost had to do it if you wanted to remain at the highest level of the game because everybody was doing it.
Right. That's exactly the point I was getting to. That if you're going to take this by the letter of the law and say that and take some sort of principled stance about who deserves to get in, what is the point of having a Hall of Fame? Because Bonds, A-Rod, Ortiz, no-brainer Hall of Famers based on their numbers. And I will never believe that PEDs are the difference between them being good players and them being Hall of Fame caliber players, or all-star players and Hall of Fame caliber players. I can't believe it makes that much of a difference, right? This is a principle thing of you don't cheat the game. But we're to the point where, and that's where I really feel like these next couple of years, and I think that's the point you're getting to originally, Chris, and then Josh, you just made as well, is what are you going to do? Are you just going to erase this period of baseball's history and say none of these guys deserve to get in? To me, that's just silly.
And
so
sorry, go ahead. My bad.
So the interesting part of this is, okay, and I saw Mina Kimes brought this up, is there something you can do where you say, okay, when we vote, we're voting based strictly on the field accomplishments, personal record, playing ability, statistics, numbers, all that stuff. But then have a sort of different tracks as to how that person is then recognized or honored in Cooperstown.
Mm-hmm.
Curt Schilling can be listed as a Hall of Famer on the list of Hall of Famers. Does that mean that he necessarily needs to have a plaque or be invited to give a speech or have some sort of recognition in the Cooperstown exhibit? No. He could just be listed as a Hall of Famer because his credentials are that of a Hall of Famer.
Mm-hmm.
And again, there's no perfect solution here, but that's what's so fascinating to me about this is are we really just going to get to a point where if you're associated with anything that stains baseball, you're just not in the Hall of Fame? What are we doing if that's the point? Who is a Hall of Fame worthy player then?
Well, it all comes down to this question for me of what we being the baseball community, fans, players, former players, want the Hall of Fame to be.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think there's definitely an argument to be made of, right, not putting in known steroid users is not erasing history. It depends on what you want your criteria to be, because that's sort of the problem. And you hit on it with what Mina Kimes said and things like that. Is, do you want history? Do you want the Hall of Fame to be about recognizing an individual's contributions to the game and their place in history as the best player? Do you want the Hall of Fame to be the best players of every era? Do you want to say these are the best players? These are the players who define the game in this period of time and throughout history. The problem is, and that's certainly a valid, like, if that's what you want, then you look at the stats mostly alone and you don't worry about those other things. The problem is that the way it's currently written, like you said, like you read, Josh, the so-called character clause and those other criteria, that combined with the fact that, as you mentioned too, those who are inducted are not just recognized, they're honored. That's the problem. That's the clash you run into, because it's one thing to recognize someone for their contributions to the game. You won these World Series, you were an all-star 18 times, whatever. But But it's another thing when you're simultaneously, when the Hall of Fame is as currently constructed, you're kind of combine that with honoring someone for their contributions beyond just what you're going to find on a baseball reference page. And they get to give a speech, and they get a plaque, and they get applause, and they get honored as not just a great player, but a great, ambassador to the game, someone who should be honored. And the problem is he has some players that fit one of those criteria, not the other.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not a new problem, of course. And so, yeah, it's an imperfect situation, but it all kind of comes down to, and I say this not having a great answer at the end of my little spiel here, is that
at the end of your speech.
It depends. At the end of my speech, yeah, is that what do we want the answer to be? Do you want the Hall of Fame, right? And so maybe there is some sort of compromise, but then the question becomes, well, how do you calculate which, right? Like, I certainly think there's some appeal to the idea of, right, maybe put someone in the Hall of Fame, like a Kurt Schilling, but then they don't get a chance to do some of those things that are more honorary in nature. But how do you decide who gets that? It becomes another tricky thing, right? You're going to have another vote to decide, here's the vote for them to get in the Hall of Fame, but here's a separate vote where you apply the character clause to decide if they're going to get to give a speech or not, because then that becomes a tricky, like, it's like, how do you do that? How do you decide? And I mean, I guess you're right. I don't want to give into the whole slippery slope argument too much, because sometimes, yes, you just have to make calls one way or another. But whose call is that to make? What happens when that happens in the future? It's such a tricky thing. And the problem is, what do you want the Hall of Fame to be? And at the end of the day, it's tricky. I don't have like a great answer, because go ahead, Josh.
Here, I want the Hall of Fame to be a complete picture of the history of the game.
That's why I am too.
And that's right. So you have to decide, is the Hall of Fame, and I suppose ideally it's a mixture. Right. I mean, nobody's arguing that Kurt Schilling is the elitist of the elite in terms of the best baseball players of all time.
Right.
But he still has a Hall of Fame resume. So it's not like every Hall of Famer is an elite baseball player. I mean, there was a time when Kurt Schilling was one of the best pitchers in baseball, but if you're making a list of the 10 best pitchers of all time, Schilling's probably not on it, right?
No.
So my point is, my point there is that it's not necessarily the elitist of the elite club, right?
Sure, yeah. It's not like it's really the top, 0.1% ever. It's the top 1%.
Right. So inherently, for that to be the case, there has to be an aspect of history, right? And to a certain extent, right? Because I can say I want the Hall of Fame to be history, but I also don't want Jordan Schaefer to be a Hall of Famer, right? I once upon a time was a really big fan of Jordan Schaefer, and I just know that his career was not. I still remember him hitting a home run for the Braves against the Phillies after, like on opening night or something. It was like his first major league at bat ever. I still remember it like it was yesterday. But at the same time, I think you're missing. I think we're missing really at the end of the day what the Hall of Fame is, because the Hall of Fame is a museum. That's essentially what the Hall of Fame is. And I feel, at least in my head, and part of what I want the Hall of Fame to be. And if you're just not having any like I think A-Rod should probably be in the Hall of Fame, because it just doesn't make sense to me that Alex Rodriguez is not in the ultimate baseball museum. And the same can be said for David Ortiz. So it's a tricky line to sort of straddle. Is right. The question that you pose, Chris, is the exact right one. Is what do you want the Hall of Fame to be? Do you want the Hall of Fame to be this almost unreachable group of squeaky clean players who never, at least on the outside, did anything wrong or anything against the game of baseball? Or do you want it to be a complete picture of these are the players that are the most important players of baseball's history, regardless of why they are there. Like if their numbers reach that threshold, does their inclusion to paint the picture of Major League Baseball's history and their dominance of that era, right? Talk about Sammy Sosa.
Mm-hmm.
Sosa definitely has the numbers to be a Hall of Famer, but I was just looking and he hold on one second.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, his
only
numbers aren't that high.
17% of the voters voted to put Sammy Sosa in the Hall of Fame. And so like that's just never going to, like, he's just never going to get to the point where he's going to have enough votes, right? So
Right. Right.
so do we want Sammy Sosa to be a part of it? He's absolutely a player worthy of it from his on the field performance, but is his role in the really awful, the really horrible and talked about performance enhancing drugs part of Major League Baseball, is his role in that too much to put him in?
Here's my and before I get to my little solution, I can sort of suggest if Kurt Schilling doesn't want to be on the ballot next year, then just don't put Kurt Schilling on the ballot next year. This doesn't need to be some sort of fight. I don't. If you want to opt out, you should be able to opt out. At the end of the day, like you said, Chris, it's about recognizing and honoring these people. If he doesn't want to be part of that, then that's his choice. I don't
Sure.
see why that's so hard, but maybe somebody else has other thoughts. The one thing that I sort of thought as you were talking, Chris, is maybe the best solution is something like you vote, you have sort of three options for voting. You vote no, you vote yes, and you vote
Mm-hmm.
yes with full honors or whatever phrase you want to use. Where if you just vote yes, that means that person is inducted as a member of the Hall of Fame, but that's where it stops. The full honors is the the plaque, the bust in Cooperstown, being part of the museum aspect of it, the speech, all of those things. So if you get
Mm-hmm.
75%, and maybe you need to get 50% or something saying, you need to have 75% of people saying yes and 55 and 50 at least 50% of people saying yes with accolade or with honors or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
then you create some threshold, a second threshold. But maybe that's the simplest way to do it, where somebody decides something but it's not incredibly messy.
Mm-hmm.
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 Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it becomes the elephant in the room.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It, yeah. It would sort of open up that conversation, and on the one hand, in that specific case, which I know you're not making a case about that specific case, but that specific case, I really don't care if Kurt Schilling throws a fit. I really don't care what Kurt Schilling thinks, because he's a horrible human being, and I have no problem saying that on the air. But yeah, I know it's a bigger case, right? When you start applying it in other circumstances that aren't as clear cut in my eyes. And one thing that I think is interesting too, and I'm reading more about this now, because I will admit I don't know as much as I should know about, as I should know, as I feel I should know about the Hall of Fame. And so the National Baseball Hall of Fame it's the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum.
Okay.
It's two things. And so the museum itself includes you know, exhibits that are talking about different eras of baseball and different key players. It isn't necessarily just here's all the players in the Hall of Fame, here's all their plaques from the 1800s to the 1950s to whenever.
Sure.
So I think in some sense, one potential idea is you can put people in the museum without putting them in the Hall of Fame. You know, you can recognize an era of baseball and have an exhibit about, I don't know, you're not going to call it the steroid era, you know, but
You
I don't know how you
should.
want
You
to.
should,
You
but
should.
they won't
Yeah,
do
that's
but
what
they
I was
won't do
gonna
that.
say.
I mean, I'd be fine with that, but it probably won't happen.
Right.
But yeah, whether you can recognize people from an era without giving them all those other things that comes with being a Hall of Famer.
Mm.
And you know, it is tricky because it's like, because I don't think we're not arguing about this, but right, the tricky part is, right, if I'm a Hall of Fame voter right now with the ballot in my hand, I don't mean right now, but as in a few months ago, if I would be to be voting, and I'm looking at the criteria as it's established, then I am going to apply that character test. So the question really necessarily, which I think, none of us are making, but some other people have made, is, right, it's easy to just sort of blame the voters, which is it's the Baseball Writers Association of America. You have to be in for so long to get a vote. It's a complicated process. And there's certainly times when criticizing them, individual voters for their votes in groups, is valid. But you have to also look at what's the criteria that's established. I'm not actually sure. I don't think it's I don't think it's them who's established the criteria. I think it may be the Hall of Fame. I'm not sure. I'm
I
not sure
think
where
you
that
might be right
criteria.
on that. Hmm.
So I'm not sure necessarily that it is the Baseball Writers Association of America that gets to decide what now they get to decide, those individual members, how they're going to apply it.
Mhm.
But the criteria that's laid out as having character and integrity and all those other things, I think, is provided by the Hall of Fame. So it's just such a tricky process. And I'm not, there's certainly people out there who um, sort of just try to oversimplify it into these voters are dumb, and it's tricky because they have to apply criteria that I don't think that they're creating. Um, and as it's currently written, so it's sort of, I think we're kind of all in agreement. Which way do you want to take it? Sort of depends on. I mean, I think you guys have made it clear which way you want to take it, and I'm not opposed to taking it that way. I think if you're going to continue to treat Hall of Famers as by honoring them in that honorary nature, then I would be okay with players getting recognized but not inducted into the Hall. Like, I wouldn't have a problem. Then I'm sort of saying that if there's a resistance to changing the character aspect and those other factors that go into the Hall of Fame vote, okay. But then I'm okay without some of these guys getting in. Let's recognize them in another way.
Mm.
And if you want them to get in and be Hall of Famers, then we have to change what that means and what that entails.
Sure.
And that's tricky too, because it's sort of like, how do you do that when the system's been the way that it's been? I suppose the best way to do would be to add rather than change, right? Would be to add recognition for these guys who don't get in rather than to change what being in means. So I guess that's what I would be in favor of. But it's a tricky process.
And you're getting to the point where you're going to sort of, if you go down this, can sort of be where we end. But
Mm-hmm.
if you're going to make some sort of change to allow the best players from the past 20 or so years, 25 years in,
Mm-hmm.
we're to the point in this voting process, as you talked about with Sammy Sosa, Josh, where you're going to have to retroactively add some guys.
Mm-hmm.
You can't just start doing this now. Let Barry Bonds in, but now let Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa in,
Right.
or start with the A-Rod.
Yeah.
You got to go.
Yeah.
You got to go back.
Right.
You can't change the rules halfway through.
Right. And that's why I feel like at the end of the day, we'll end up sort of pushing through this period, the next 3 or 4 years, without any drastic changes to the process, to who gets in or doesn't, because it opens up all those cans of worms. So that's what sort of makes me think that we're just going to trudge through these next few years. Maybe nobody gets in next year too. But then, I'm not saying that's necessarily the right thing to do, but maybe that's what will happen. And then 25 years from now, people will decide to come back and make some sort of special, I don't know, exhibit for all those others who didn't get in, who were a big part of it. I don't know. It's tricky. But well, I'll throw another couple. I'll throw a couple other baseball random thoughts out here before we go to our break, if
Please
that's
do.
cool.
Yeah.
Um, One thing, the Blue Jays are very, very active in. They've gotten active in recent days. I think that they are the second. They're legitimately could be the second best team in the AL East now, because they've added George Springer, which is huge for them. Um, he has been the fourth best outfielder in baseball over the past 5 seasons. Only Mike Trout, Mookie Betts, and Christian Yelich have higher WAR value.
That's pretty
He's
good.
very
That's
good.
pretty good company.
Yeah.
Pretty good company. He's very good. They added Marcus Simeon, so they've got all these moving parts. Um, so this is a really good team, like a really exciting team. I'll say I could go into a 30-minute spiel about them, but it's a really good team now. I think that they on paper look better than the Tampa Bay Rays now. I think they're a legitimate challenger to the Yankees on paper. So that's going to be fun to watch. Blue Jays being competitive.
Here's the problem, though.
Mm.
Clearly,
Oh, man.
the issue is now pitching, right? That from a
Is it
roster.
though? Yeah,
Well,
it is, but it is, but like they're not necessarily that much worse than the Yankees.
No, right. It's not a horrible pitching staff. It's just not what you have over on the West Coast with the Dodgers.
Oh,
right.
oh yeah.
This is the point we're at with the Blue Jays. We're talking about them compared to the best teams in baseball.
Yeah, yeah.
The idea, in theory, then of going and getting Steven Matz is a good one, except for Steven Matz has never pitched a qualified number of innings. Never.
He's also just very, very bad.
That doesn't really solve it's the same question.
Mm-hmm.
I love Ryu. I have been it blows my mind that people just sort of disregarded Ryu and Kenta Maeda on those Dodgers staffs. I'm a huge fan of both of them, but that's my question is they went and made a move for a pitcher, but it's a guy who is not durable and is not exactly getting you excited about. It's not like he's a Cy Young candidate when he's out there healthy.
Yeah. Now he was bottom 5 percentile in the league as in like among the fifth, like the bottom 5 percentage of all pitchers in expected ERA, slugging percentage against, hard hit percentage. They were just like guys were just destroying him last year. Like I'm not too confident that he's a needle mover. But so I'm with you. Like that's the conversation we can have with them.
Yeah.
I don't think their pitching is necessarily that much worse because they have a bunch of guys, and the Yankees pitching isn't necessarily foolproof now. So it's good enough to maybe compete in the East, but not good enough to compete with the, for a World Series necessarily. So I agree with you there for sure. You have any other thoughts, Josh?
I got a couple other things real quickly. The Phillies had to get that JT Real Muto deal done. Wow, that was a twister. Absolutely had to do it. Yeah. What kind of message are you sending if you don't fork out the money to go get your best catcher in baseball back when you spend all that money on Bryce Harper?
Roughly the same message that the Indians send. Well, you spend so much money on Bryce, so you might be sending an even more confusing message than the Indians. At least you know what you're getting from the Indians. Like they're not going to spend money on you if you're good. So
thank goodness they got that done for just the sport of baseball.
Yeah,
they followed through.
Now the question is, can they actually make themselves better than the third or fourth team in that best team in that division?
Right.
Which is not saying so much.
No. And then in New York, Chris, you made this point before. The Yankees are going to be incredibly reliant on a bunch of guys who don't stay healthy in that rotation. It's the same problem with the Blue Jays, except for the Yankees have Garrett Cole, but all these, and again, it looks pretty good on paper, but that's assuming these guys actually log innings, and history suggests they don't.
The upside for those guys is a lot higher than the Blue Jays guys.
Exactly. Yeah. In theory, it sounds like a good idea. And then also, I'm curious about Trevor Bauer still sitting there. New York Mets, go get him. You opened up a spot. Nobody else seems. I mean, we're talking about the Dodgers.
Yeah, I don't think the Angels. I don't know if you saw this. The Angels were my pick to land Bauer, but it recently came out not recently came out, but it was recently reported something that people didn't necessarily seem to know. Bauer has previously worked with the Angels pitching coach, Mickey Callaway. They did not get along, and the LA Times reported that the relationship is believed to be eroded beyond repair.
Oh.
I don't know if he's going to LA, to the Angels at least. So, yeah, maybe the Mets.
Somebody go get him.
Yeah.
Like, I know the dude's weird, but somebody go get him. Somebody go get him.
I feel like he could be the guy who holds out until, like, spring training is, like, a week in, and then all of a sudden, he seems like the guy who's not going to want to lower his demands very quickly. And so we'll see, though.
And that's why, to a certain extent, that's why like it doesn't really matter what anybody else does until they prove that their guys can stay healthy. Like the Dodgers just seem to be able to piece it together, because like the Yankees, I mean, not particularly close in the last couple of years to getting to the World Series, even though they've been one of the two best teams on paper for the last 2-3 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I can't decide if the longevity of this upcoming season will players will be more healthy because they haven't played a full season in 2 years, or if it'll be if we'll get to game 110, 115, and guys will be completely falling apart because they haven't played a full season in 2 years. I can't decide which one, but death taxes and the Yankees betting on guys that can't stay healthy, right? And then hoping that they have it all together and everyone's healthy for the right 6 week stretch in October, right? I mean, that's essentially where we've gotten with the Yankees now. They're similar to pick an NBA team that can't prove anything else in the regular season, right? It now with the Yankees, it's sure they're gonna be fine. They're gonna be around the top of the AL East, but they're gonna be not healthy most of the season. Can they get healthy and actually make it happen in the playoffs and put enough emphasis on starting pitching to actually get the job done? Because clearly just putting all your emphasis on the batting order hasn't quite gotten them there, right? And that's been the biggest issue, is that you have Garrett Cole, but then who comes after Garrett Cole? And when you need somebody to start game 3 of that series, start game 4 of that series, you just don't have an arm there that you truly believe in. And that's been the biggest issue. We'll see if that changes this year, but it's also guys that, again, you don't have incredible faith in their longevity.
And the answer to that question the past 2 years is no longer there. He's going back to pitch in Japan, and that was Masahiro Tanaka.
Right.
Who was not, yes, he got hurt from time to time, but generally he was a reliable guy who was incredibly valuable to that team for that reason. He wasn't out there sporting a 2.80 ERA, but he was good. He had good stuff, and he just logged innings. You could count on him. You felt okay about him as a game 2 starter, and now that's not even there.
Right, and so it's like they haven't really exactly pivoted from learning, like you said, Josh. They've fallen short in the pitching department, and they haven't exactly, like, if these players, if Corey Kluber rebounds and Jameson Taillon is outstanding, then it could work out. But they haven't exactly done anything this offseason to make you think, oh, okay, they brought back Tanaka, they brought in a great 3 and a good 4, and they're number 4 starter, and they're going to be. I guess they've sort of locked themselves into this approach because they're right up against the luxury tax. Like, they just have so much committed to those bats, and they were so committed to bringing back DJ LeMahieu that they just, and I'm not trying to defend, they can always spend more money than the Yankees, but they just, as far as their own cap, they sort of say, oh no, we're out of money, we're just going to have to piece this together again and hope it works. So
and you're spending money on bats that aren't even consistently getting you the best record in the AL, or the best record in the AL East for that matter, right? I mean,
right. They're not going to get out of that Stanton contract or whatever.
I mean, right. And I mean, Stanton can't stay on the field. Judge can't stay on the field. Nobody can stay on the field for as long as you need them to when you're paying that much money. And our good friend Will is hitting his head against the wall right now. It makes no sense that the Rays are better than the Yankees. It just doesn't. That Rays team should never be able to put together a better season than the Yankees based on the talent at hand. But I mean, it's a little bit like the 76ers, that you can't just throw talent at the wall and hope that it all sticks at the same time. It's a little different in baseball, right? Because it doesn't really matter if Stanton's playing well. It doesn't affect whether Judge can hit the baseball or not, like it does with Embiid and Simmons. But the point is still the same, is that we keep just throwing as much talent at the wall as we possibly can in New York and hoping that it all sticks to the point that you can win a World Series, and it hasn't yet. Let's take a quick break, and then we'll come back, talk about the Big 12 SEC Big 12, Big 12 SEC challenge. It says Big 12,
Big 12
SEC.
SEC.
It says Big 12 SEC on the screen here as well, so I'll go with that. Big 12 SEC challenge. We'll talk about that next year. Watching 110 Daily on the 110 Sports Network.